What appeared at first to be just another extremist faction quickly revealed itself as something far more ambitious, far more methodical. Entire cities collapsed in days, Iraqi army units melted away, abandoning American-made equipment that ISIS immediately turned against its enemies. Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, fell with shocking ease. For observers in Western capitals, the question was no longer if ISIS was dangerous, but how such a collapse had happened so fast, and what came next. ISIS was not improvising, it was executing a strategy refined through years of insurgency. The group combined battlefield brutality with media sophistication, broadcasting executions and victories to project inevitability. Violence was not only a weapon, it was a recruitment tool. Each video, each atrocity, carried a message: resistance was futile, submission was survival. And for many communities in northern Iraq and eastern Syria, there would be no chance to choose either. The declaration of a caliphate in June 2014 marked a turning point. With a single announcement, ISIS rejected the post-World War I order that had defined the modern Middle East. Borders drawn after the fall of the Ottoman Empire were declared meaningless. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi proclaimed himself caliph, demanding allegiance from Muslims worldwide. The symbolism was deliberate and electrifying. Thousands of foreign fighters answered the call, traveling from Europe, North Africa, and Asia to join what ISIS promised was a divinely sanctioned state. Yet while the world debated ideology and geopolitics, the consequences on the ground were immediate and catastrophic. Communities that did not conform to ISIS's rigid interpretation of Islam were marked for destruction. Christians fled ancient towns, Shia Muslims were executed en masse. But no group would suffer more swiftly or more completely than the Yazidis of northern Iraq. The Yazidis were a small, ancient religious minority with beliefs older than Islam itself. To ISIS, they were heretics beyond redemption. As ISIS fighters swept toward the Sinjar region, villages were encircled, men separated from women, and choices were erased. Those who refused conversion were executed. Women and girls were abducted, sold, and trafficked as spoils of war. It was a campaign of extermination carried out in plain sight, its brutality documented even as it unfolded. Within days, tens of thousands of Yazidis fled toward the Sinjar Mountains. They escaped not to safety, but to exposure. Trapped on rocky slopes under the August sun, families ran out of water. Children collapsed from dehydration, the elderly died where they fell. From above, satellite images captured clusters of people slowly fading into stillness. On the ground, ISIS tightened its grip, cutting off escape routes and sealing the fate of those left behind. In London, Washington, and Brussels, intelligence briefings grew increasingly grim. Analysts warned that ISIS was no longer just a regional insurgency, it was a proto-state with territory, revenue, foreign fighters, and ideological reach. Still, hesitation prevailed. Western governments carried the scars of Iraq and Afghanistan. The political cost of another Middle Eastern war loomed heavily, especially in the United Kingdom, where public trust in military intervention had been badly shaken. Yet the images from Sinjar pierced that caution. This was not a distant battlefield clash. It was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time. Aid organizations warned that without immediate action, thousands would die within days. The question confronting policymakers was no longer abstract. What happens if we do nothing? And more unsettling still, what happens if we intervene and cannot stop? For Britain, the dilemma was especially sharp. The government had not planned for war. There was no appetite for combat operations, no parliamentary mandate, no formal strategy for engagement. But history has a way of imposing choices. The rise of ISIS was not waiting for consensus, and the mountains of Sinjar were running out of time. Behind closed doors, military planners examined options that stopped short of war. Humanitarian assistance, surveillance, evacuation support. Each seemed limited, controlled, politically defensible. Yet even as these discussions unfolded, intelligence reports made one fact increasingly clear: ISIS was advancing faster than aid alone could counter, and its ambitions stretched far beyond northern Iraq. As the Yazidi crisis deepened, another realization began to take shape, one that would quietly alter Britain's role in the conflict. The United Kingdom could observe, it could condemn. It could deliver relief from the air, but once aircraft entered Iraqi skies, once intelligence assets began tracking ISIS movements, the boundary between compassion and combat would grow dangerously thin. This story is not just about how ISIS rose, it is about how the world was pulled step by careful step toward a war it did not formally declare, but would soon be deeply invested in. If you're finding this account valuable, please consider clicking the subscribe button and liking the video. It genuinely helps this history reach more people who want to understand how modern conflicts truly begin. Because the next decision would not involve bombs or bullets, only aid. And yet, that single choice would quietly place Britain on a path from which retreat would become almost impossible. On the 9th of August, 2014, British aircraft lifted off not in anger, but in urgency. There were no bombs loaded beneath their wings, no targets marked on strike maps. Instead, two RAC-130 Hercules transport planes crossed into Iraqi airspace carrying pallets of food, water, and emergency supplies. Below them, tens of thousands of Yazidi refugees clung to life on the Sinjar Mountains, surrounded by ISIS fighters and cut off from escape. From the outside, the mission appeared simple: drop aid, save lives, withdraw. But even as the first packages floated down on parachutes, commanders monitoring the operation understood something unsettling. The humanitarian crisis was inseparable from the battlefield that had created it. Every supply drop required precise navigation through hostile airspace. Every flight risked provoking a response from an enemy that had already shown its willingness to shoot down aircraft. The images that followed were harrowing. Aid bundles landed among desperate families scrambling for survival. Children waved frantically at aircraft passing overhead, unaware that those same skies were increasingly contested. British crews reported seeing ISIS positions from the air vehicles, checkpoints, fighters moving freely across territory that only weeks earlier had belonged to the Iraqi state. The contrast was impossible to ignore, humanitarian relief unfolding beneath the shadow of an advancing army. As the days passed, it became clear that aid alone would not resolve the crisis. Refugees needed evacuation routes. ISIS needed to be watched. The risk of massacres remained immediate. Quietly, without public fanfare, Britain began expanding its presence. Tornado GR for fast jets were deployed to the region not to strike, but to observe. Their orders were explicit: gather intelligence, identify threats, and do not fire. With that deployment, the nature of British involvement subtly changed. Surveillance pods captured high-resolution imagery of ISIS movements. Communications intercepts revealed command structures. Drones began mapping supply routes and strongholds. The RAF was no longer simply delivering aid, it was building a picture of the war. And once a war is understood in such detail, ignorance is no longer an option. Chinook helicopters were placed on standby for potential rescue missions. Their crews trained for rapid insertions into hostile terrain, rehearsing evacuations under fire. These plans were precautionary. Officials insisted contingencies rather than commitments. Yet contingency planning itself suggested that the possibility of direct engagement was no longer hypothetical. In Parliament, the government was careful with its language. Britain was not at war. There would be no repeat of Iraq in 2003, no ground invasion, no open-ended commitment. The mission was humanitarian, defensive, limited. Those assurances were repeated often, partly to reassure the public and partly to reassure lawmakers who remembered how quickly limited missions had expanded in the past. But history rarely respects political phrasing. As surveillance intensified, British analysts began sharing intelligence with allies, particularly the United States. Coalition coordination deepened. Targets were identified, tracked, and monitored, not yet attacked, but catalogued for the moment when restraint might no longer be possible. Each intelligence briefing carried an unspoken implication. If ISIS was allowed to consolidate, the cost of stopping it later would be far higher. Meanwhile, on the ground, the humanitarian situation remained fragile. Some Yazidis were evacuated through hastily secured corridors, others remained trapped. Reports of mass killings and sexual enslavement continued to surface. International law experts began using a word governments are always reluctant to invoke: genocide. Once spoken, it carried moral weight that was difficult to set aside. Within the British military, there was a growing recognition that neutrality was eroding. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions could see ISIS fighters preparing attacks, moving heavy weapons, threatening civilians. The Tornadoes carried weapons, but orders forbade their use. That restraint became a point of tension. Watching violence unfold from the air without acting tested the limits of the mission's original intent. At the same time, fears of escalation haunted every decision. British officials remembered Afghanistan, where early humanitarian objectives had evolved into a decades-long war. They remembered Iraq, where intelligence gathering had paved the way for invasion. The question now was whether Britain could remain engaged without becoming entangled, or whether the very act of watching ISIS so closely made withdrawal impossible. Behind closed doors, discussions turned increasingly strategic. ISIS was not only destabilizing Iraq, it was inspiring attacks abroad. Foreign fighters holding British passports were among its ranks. Intelligence agencies warned that battle-hardened extremists could eventually return home. The crisis on the Sinjar Mountains was tragic, but it was no longer the only concern driving policy. By late August, the operational picture had sharpened. Britain knew where ISIS stored weapons, how it moved forces, and which routes it used to advance. Allies began asking difficult questions. If Britain could see ISIS preparing attacks, why should others bear the responsibility of stopping them alone? Silence in such circumstances became a form of decision. Still, Parliament had not voted for war. No bombs had fallen from British aircraft. The government held the line publicly, insisting that intelligence gathering and humanitarian support were not steps toward combat. But privately, military planners prepared for the moment that line might break, because once Parliament was recalled, events would move quickly. Operation Shader, though not yet named in public consciousness, was already taking shape. Its foundations were being laid not with explosions, but with surveillance feeds, coordination meetings, and moral calculations that grew heavier by the day. The war was beginning quietly, almost invisibly, far from the headlines that usually announce conflict. What began as an act of compassion had placed Britain inside a widening circle of responsibility. Aid drops had turned into reconnaissance, observation had turned into preparation. And soon, a single political decision would determine whether the RAF remained a witness to history or became one of its decisive actors. By late summer of 2014, the illusion of distance had collapsed. What was happening in Iraq and Syria was no longer a remote, humanitarian tragedy, it was a rapidly evolving security crisis with global implications. Intelligence briefings landing on ministers' desks in London carried a new tone of urgency. ISIS was not merely holding territory. It was entrenching itself, governing populations, and exporting ideology with alarming efficiency. And Britain, already watching from the sky, now faced a choice that could no longer be postponed. The pressure did not come from a single direction. On the ground, Iraqi forces continued to falter. Kurdish Peshmerga units fought bravely, but were outgunned. Civilians remained exposed wherever ISIS advanced. In the air, American aircraft had already begun striking targets, degrading ISIS positions, but unable to halt its momentum alone. Quietly, Allied commanders began asking what Britain would do if the situation deteriorated further, and what it would mean if it did nothing. At the NATO summit in Newport, Wales, in September 2014, the language hardened. Behind closed doors, US officials argued that ISIS represented a generational threat, not a passing insurgency. Coalition warfare, they insisted, required shared burden and shared risk. Britain's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance contributions were valuable but incomplete. Without the authority to strike, the RAF was supplying information for a war it was not yet allowed to fight. Publicly, British leaders remained cautious. The memory of the 2013 parliamentary vote rejecting airstrikes in Syria still loomed large. That defeat had signaled deep skepticism toward military intervention, even in the face of humanitarian disaster. Prime Minister David Cameron understood that any move toward combat would require not just strategic justification, but political legitimacy. This time, Parliament would have to decide. On the 26th of September, 2014, Cameron recalled Parliament for an emergency session. The symbolism mattered. This was not an executive action taken in silence, it was a deliberate appeal to democratic authority. As MPs gathered, the question before them was framed starkly: was Britain willing to use force to stop ISIS in Iraq, at the request of the Iraqi government, alongside international partners? Cameron's argument focused on necessity rather than ambition. This was not regime change, it was not occupation. It was a limited mission to prevent further atrocities and protect British national security. He warned that ISIS had already attracted fighters from the United Kingdom and that allowing the group to consolidate would invite future attacks at home. The threat, he argued, was not hypothetical, it was already unfolding. The debate lasted 7 hours. MPs from all parties spoke, many haunted by the consequences of previous wars. Skepticism was fierce, but so was moral outrage. The genocide of the Yazidis weighed heavily on the chamber. So did the intelligence assessments now openly discussed. In the end, the vote was decisive. Parliament authorized airstrikes against ISIS targets in Iraq by an overwhelming majority. With that vote, the final restraint fell away. Within days, Tornado GR-4 aircraft based at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus were retasked. No longer restricted to observation, they now carried laser-guided bombs and brimstone missiles, precision weapons designed to minimize civilian casualties while destroying armored vehicles and fortified positions. The shift from surveillance to combat was swift, almost seamless, because much of the groundwork had already been laid. The first strikes targeted ISIS, heavy weapons threatening Kurdish forces. British pilots, already familiar with the terrain from months of reconnaissance, executed their missions with clinical precision. Commanders emphasized rules of engagement and proportionality. Every strike required confirmation, authorization, and legal review. This was war, but it was a war bound tightly by political oversight and public scrutiny. Soon, MQ-9 Reaper drones joined the operation, providing persistent surveillance and, when authorized, delivering strikes of their own. The RAW's role expanded rapidly, not in dramatic leaps, but through steady accumulation. Each successful mission reinforced the logic of the campaign. Each prevented attack strengthened the argument that intervention was working. And with every step forward, the prospect of stepping back grew more distant. Operation Shader now had a name, a mandate, and momentum. Official statements stressed its limited scope. There would be no British combat troops on the ground. No mission creep, no open-ended commitment. Training and support, yes, but fighting would remain in the air. Those assurances were carefully worded, shaped by political memory as much as strategic intent. Yet even as bombs fell on ISIS targets, new dilemmas emerged. Strikes in Iraq pushed fighters toward Syria. Intelligence revealed command centers just across the border, beyond the original authorization. Allies debated whether limiting action to Iraq made strategic sense when ISIS operated seamlessly across borders it did not recognize. Once again, a line drawn for political reasons collided with a battlefield that ignored it. Within Britain, public opinion shifted cautiously. Initial support for the strikes reflected relief that action was finally being taken, but questions followed quickly. How long would this last? What would success look like? Could air power alone defeat an organization rooted in ideology as much as territory? History offered no comforting answers. Inside military headquarters, planners spoke less about endings and more about phases, degrading ISIS capabilities, supporting local forces, containing the threat. Each phase implied another. The war was no longer an emergency response, it was becoming a sustained campaign. And like so many conflicts before it, it had begun not with a declaration of war, but with a vote framed as necessity. If this account is helping you understand how modern wars quietly escalate, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It truly helps this work reach others who want more than headlines, who want to know how decisions are actually made. Because the decision to strike was not the end of the story, it was the point of no return. And what followed would test Britain's resolve, its promises, and its memory of wars it once believed it had left behind. By the end of 2014, it was no longer possible to describe Britain's involvement against ISIS as temporary. What had begun with humanitarian airdrops and cautious surveillance had evolved into a sustained air campaign, one that demanded constant attention, resources, and political justification. Operation Shader was now firmly embedded in Britain's military posture, even as leaders continued to insist that its scope was limited. Airstrikes intensified through late 2014 and into 2015. RAF Tornadoes and Reapers flew day after day, striking ISIS vehicles, weapons caches, command posts, and supply routes. Each mission was framed as defensive, protecting civilians, supporting Iraqi forces, degrading ISIS's ability to advance. Yet the operational tempo told a deeper story. Britain was no longer reacting to isolated crises, it was actively shaping the battlefield. On the ground, a new phase quietly unfolded. British soldiers were deployed not as combat troops, but as trainers. In Erbil and other secure locations, small teams instructed Kurdish Peshmerga and Iraqi forces in the use of heavy machine guns, counter-IED tactics, and battlefield coordination. Officially, this was support, not combat. But for the soldiers involved, the distinction often felt academic. They were operating in a war zone, under threat, contributing directly to the fight. The training mission expanded rapidly. What started with just a dozen British personnel grew to hundreds. Over time, more than 31,000 Iraqi and Kurdish fighters would be trained with British assistance. Each expansion required parliamentary approval, each justified as necessary to ensure local forces could hold territory retaken with coalition air power. The logic was compelling and familiar. Air strikes could break ISIS advances, but only ground forces could secure lasting gains. Throughout this period, the fear of mission creep never disappeared. Memories of Iraq and Afghanistan hung over every debate. Government ministers repeatedly reassured Parliament and the public there would be no British ground combat units, no boots on the front line. Britain would enable, not occupy, support, not replace. Those promises became political anchors, repeated so often that their repetition itself suggested unease. Only once was that line briefly crossed. During a rapid evacuation of refugees, British troops were deployed to secure a helicopter extraction zone under immediate threat. The operation lasted less than 24 hours. The soldiers withdrew as quickly as they arrived. Officials emphasized the speed and necessity of the action, but the episode underscored how fragile red lines become in fluid conflicts. Even carefully defined limits can bend under pressure. By 2015, Operation Shader had become the most intense RAF flying operation in a quarter century. Aircraft had flown more than 1,300 missions in the first year alone, conducting hundreds of strikes. The scale rivaled major Cold War-era operations, yet it unfolded with far less public attention. There were no mass mobilizations, no dramatic declarations, just steady, relentless engagement far from home. At the same time, the war's geography widened. Intelligence assessments made clear that ISIS could not be meaningfully defeated in Iraq alone. Its leadership, logistics, and recruitment pipelines stretched deep into Syria. After months of debate, Parliament would later authorize strikes there as well, acknowledging openly what had long been implicit. The conflict was regional, not confined by borders drawn on maps. Despite battlefield successes, the end remained elusive. ISIS lost territory, but adapted. Fighters dispersed, embedded themselves in cities, and shifted tactics. Each victory raised new questions. What happens after ISIS? Who governs liberated areas? How long does external support remain before it becomes dependency? These were questions without easy answers and ones Britain would continue to confront. Looking back, the defining feature of Britain's war against ISIS was not a single dramatic moment, but a chain of decisions, each framed as necessary, each narrowing the path back to disengagement. Humanitarian aid led to surveillance. Surveillance led to strikes, strikes led to training missions. and training missions bound Britain to outcomes it could influence, but not fully control. Operation Shader was never announced as a war of choice. It was described as a war inherited imposed by events, by atrocities, by alliances, and by the fear that inaction carried its own dangers. And in that sense, it followed a pattern as old as modern warfare itself. Conflicts rarely begin with grand intentions. They begin with urgency, with limited aims, with promises of restraint. Years later, Britain would still be grappling with the consequences of those early decisions. The Yazidis would slowly return to shattered homelands. ISIS would be territorially defeated, but not erased. And the question that lingered long after the bombs fell was whether this war had truly been unavoidable, or simply inevitable once the first aircraft entered the sky.